All right, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. And thank you all for logging on for this discussion on confronting threats to election certification, the role of state and local officials. The event is hosted by the Center for Election Innovation and Research, or CEIR, and Protect Democracy. My name is Walker Irving, and I work with CEIR. CEIR is a nonpartisan nonprofit that works with election officials at the state and local level from around the country and from both sides of the aisle. They seek to build voter trust and confidence, increase voter participation, and improve the efficiency of election administration. Protect Democracy is a cross-ideological nonprofit group dedicated to defeating the authoritarian threat, building more resilient democratic institutions, and protecting our freedom and liberal democracy. Their experts and advocates use litigation, legislative and communication strategies, technology, research, and analysis to stand up for free and fair elections, the rule of law, fact-based debate, and a better democracy for future generations. Today, you're going to hear from David Becker. David is the executive director and founder of CEIR, and he's the co-author of The Big Truth, Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. He has more than 25 years of experience in elections, serving as a senior attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice voting section in both the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations, as well as leading the elections team at the Pew Charitable Trust prior to founding CEIR. You will also hear from Jessica Marsden. Jessica is the Director of Impact Programs and Counsel for Free and Fair Elections for Protect Democracy. In this role, she oversees Protect Democracy's work to ensure free and fair elections, including litigation and advocacy around voting rights and disinformation. They're joined today by three national leaders on election administration: Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, New Mexico Secretary of State Maggie Toulouse Oliver, and Gabriel Sterling, the Chief Operating Officer in the Georgia Secretary of State's office. I'll hand the conversation to David in just a moment, but first I want to cover a little housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording with all of you, anyone who registered, and we will also be posting it on the CEIR YouTube channel. We have time for questions at the end of the presentations today. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to share your questions, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. We're also pleased to be joined today by members of the media, so please consider any questions you ask to be on the record. We will not use any names or affiliations when choosing questions to be asked out loud. And now I will hand it over to David.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm particularly appreciative that we have so many election officials on watching this during what I know is an incredibly busy time. I think we're around, give or take, 50 days until the election, and all of you are working incredibly hard with a lot of things going on. But I also know you're very aware of efforts, probably in your states and in many, many other states, to mischaracterize what certification is, to turn it into an additional way to challenge the election outcomes, which is outside of the law, to give political appointees and hyper-partisans, including people who are attending political rallies, the ability to delay or potentially stop certification. And as I've traveled the country and I've talked to election officials all over the country in the last several weeks, I know several of you have indicated your concern over attempts, not so much by the election officials, but by partisans who might be on county boards or others, to slow down or stop certification in an attempt to destabilize and delegitimize an election in which the candidate that they personally preferred might have lost. I want to stress a couple of things about this. First, I am 100% confident that the actual winner of the election, as determined by the voters and accurately reported by election officials in this country, that person will take the oath of office. Any effort to delay or stop certification will fail to allow the loser of the election to steal the election. I am 100% confident in election officials all over the country. But I think we all have to be cognizant of the fact that efforts to delegitimize an election, including efforts to stall or stop certification, could brings stress and pressures to election officials, not just at the state level, but also at the county level, and fuel disinformation that can make your jobs significantly more difficult. Couple of other things I want to add about this. First, I am not only concerned about this in swing states. Often we focused on swing states. We have election officials who have dealt with this already in many swing states, but I think we're very likely to see efforts to deny or delay certification at the local and county level in any state in which the winning candidate won, brought by the losing candidate these challenges. And I'll also state this is often presented as only an issue with regard to Republicans. And I am not only concerned of this with regard to Republicans. I think it's very likely, given the Republican presidential candidate has done this before and continues to spread disinformation and lies about the election system, that if he loses, there will be an organized effort on behalf of him to try, in a kind of a desperate and pathetic attempt to try to seize power as the loser. As I said, that effort will fail. But if the Democratic presidential candidate loses, I do expect that there might be rogue actors at the county level, people who supported her, who may say, you've talked so long about certification being discretionary, now we're going to take that power and use it as well to try to delay or deny certification. Either is dangerous. Both must be fought. I know that we will be at the front lines of calling for stability in such a case. We're going to talk about this in a little bit, but certification, as people who work in elections know, is simply the non-discretionary ministerial act of giving an election legal effect. That's all it is. It's saying the person who got more votes is the winner and they get to take office. It is not the opportunity for a candidate, for political appointees or others to deny the winner the right to take office or to any legal effect of winning the election. There are other legal avenues for that. And the reason that there are attempts currently to remove the guardrails around certification is because losing candidates don't want to have to meet their obligations in a court of law that would be required under a legal challenge. They don't want to meet an evidentiary obligation. They don't want to subject evidence to scrutiny and cross-examination. They don't want a court to have to review this in a court of law, because we're now 46 months after the 2020 election, and they've failed on every single attempt to do that. And now they're just simply running away in most cases from any attempt. There's still not been a shred of evidence presented to any court anywhere in the country that would call into doubt the outcome of the 2020 election, but we still see plenty of efforts to claim that there were problems on social media where they don't have to subject their evidence to scrutiny. We have seen defendants in defamation cases in places like the Rudy Giuliani case, the Kerry Lake case, where both of those defendants, rather than claiming that what they said was true, both conceded liability and went right to the damages phase, effectively conceding that they lied and damaged the plaintiffs in those cases. And Fox News famously settled their case before going to trial and having to present evidence for nearly $800 million. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today and highlight some things. We brought together 3 election officials who know this firsthand. They're going to share their stories with you. They're going to answer your questions and prepare you for what might be coming. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jessica now, who will get the conversation started. And I really want to thank Jessica and our partners over at Protect Democracy for all they're doing in this space as well.
Thanks so much, David. So as we just heard from David, we've seen a wave of challenges to the election certification process in recent years. The officials who are joining us today have been on the forefront of dealing with those issues. And as they will tell you, election officials have the tools that they need to respond to certification challenges while ensuring that all votes are counted and that any disputes are resolved fairly. So as David said, we really have every confidence that election results can and will be certified on time this fall. But given the increasing volume of disinformation about routine election processes, from how voter rolls are maintained to how voting machines are used to count ballots, we think it's prudent to be prepared to see further certification challenges this fall. And so our goal is that you leave this webinar with a better sense of the approaches that have been used to ensure the smooth and timely certification of election results. And for those of you who are election officials, how to prepare for certification challenges in your own states. I'm going to start by asking Secretary Oliver. New Mexico was the first state to see a local official refuse to certify election results in the post-2020 period, and your office really had to develop the roadmap for how to respond. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened in Otero County in 2022 and how your office responded?
Sure. Well, thanks, Jessica and David, and everyone on both the teams. And hi, everyone. Maggie Toulouse Oliver from New Mexico. I'm happy to be here with you today. And I've been kind of taking stock lately. This is my 18th year as an election administrator, 10 years as a county clerk in Bernalillo County, New Mexico, the Albuquerque area, and now almost 8 as Secretary of State, and my 5th, I can't believe this, presidential election that I've either run or overseen. And so it's just so interesting how things have evolved over the last 2 decades. And to your point, Jessica, never in my, fill in the blank years, had I ever experienced a situation like we did in 2022. And of course, in my state, as across all states of the nation, the big lie, election denialism, whatever you want to call it, was really starting to come to a fever pitch in my state. And so much so that folks wanted to question and challenge the outcome of the primary election nowhere more fiercely than in Otero County, New Mexico, Alamogordo. If you all have ever heard of the White Sands National Monument, that's where that is. One county commissioner in particular got a couple of the others really riled up. There's only 3 county commissioners in this county. This particular county commissioner happened to be the head of an organization called Cowboys for Trump. He was at January 6th, and sort of fast forward after this whole process takes place, he's actually the first local election, or I think the first elected official in the country to be removed from office pursuant to the 14th Amendment in January 6th. But at this time in June of 2022, basically says, you know what, I just don't trust the voting machines. I have a bad feeling, literally, my gut's telling me not to certify, and so they didn't certify. And of course, our fear at that point in my office was that it wouldn't just be Otero County, right? That we still had other counties across 33 counties across the state that had not yet certified the primary election. So we moved very quickly. We filed for a writ of mandamus, which essentially is an order from the Supreme Court telling this government entity to do their job. That's what a writ of mandamus is. It says you have a non-discretionary ministerial duty, as David said, to certify these election results. You can ask questions, you can review information, but there's not really an option here. And so pursuant to the order of the court, at least 2 of the county commissioners had the wisdom to change their minds rather than face potential penalties and ultimately removal from office by the Supreme Court. But it really was a very scary process because, again, we saw at least 2 other counties in New Mexico on the verge at that time. And thankfully, thanks to that court order and Otero County coming into line, we were able to move forward and certify the rest of the election. But needless to say, this is not a process we want for anybody to have to go through, and thankfully we came through it okay.
Thanks for walking us through that. Case sort of is a case study in the types of problems that certification refusal can cause. But before we dive deeper into the problem, Secretary Benson, can you give us a little bit of a refresher on what certification is really for? Why is it a part of our process, and how is it supposed to play out?
Yeah, sure. As Maggie just laid it out, certification is a critical part of the checks and balances process. And in Michigan, we have 83 counties and a bipartisan decentralized election system. In each of our 83 counties, there are bipartisan boards of canvassers that are appointed by local Democratic and Republican Party leadership. And they have a ministerial duty to verify the unofficial election night results, say they were correct by reviewing the paper returns that print out of each machine, sort of just like another review and check. And if needed, correct any tabulation or reporting error errors before certifying. It's sort of like when you do you present your math to a supervisor or reviewer, and they look and say, yes, you added those numbers correctly. The county canvassers in that ministerial role typically simply just review as a second set of eyes on the numbers, and then certify those local elections. Then that goes up to the bipartisan state board of canvassers, similarly, in which there are 2 Republican representatives, 2 Democrat representatives selected by the parties at the state level. They then similarly review the math and certify the results. This process is a key check to just verify that the basic numbers coming out of the counting of the ballots are accurate. It's not an open-ended chance to block election results or to investigate the procedures that went into ballots being verified or not. What we're seeing is a sort of metastasizing of this role from a very ministerial one under the law to one in which folks believe that certifiers can conduct broad investigations that are really in the purview of law enforcement or the courts, or through a audit or recount system, all of which under our law happens or is able to happen after the certification process itself.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary Benson. That's such a key point, that whether it's the existing law that everyone knew about before the election, or it's the courts that have an established structure for reviewing evidence, those are appropriate forums for resolving any potential issues, and it's not a place for political appointees to just decide they don't like them. Which brings me to you, Gabe. Given, Georgia, maybe you can talk a little bit about Georgia's system of certification, and specifically, if someone were successful in delaying or denying certification for a period of time, what might happen, how that might complicate things, particularly in a presidential election where you've got tight timelines, afterwards at the county level up to the state level onto the deadlines that happen in December with regard to electoral votes, but also how you might resolve them and how you're thinking about those.
Well, obviously, like in most states, it goes down to the county level, and it has been historically, as is in Georgia, a ministerial effort. But one of the things that's been frustrating as people have discussed this, many of these people are acting like they come down a few days after the election and say yes or no, the election was done properly. These same men and women are officially, under Georgia law, the superintendents of the election itself. They get to decide the processes. They get to oversee the process. They get to work on where the polling locations are and who is hired and what they have to do and all their training. They're not coming out of nowhere on this. So this idea that they have to have more and more and more paper information at the end of the process, even though they've been a part of the process the entire time, is a little, disconcerting, that people don't understand the role. And we all know what happened for many, many years across the country. It's normally the person who's like, they've been serving in the party for a while. Let's give them this little post over here because it doesn't really mean anything. It's ministerial. And normally you'll see them at the election night parties, the same night they should be doing work. But what they normally will do is they get the 5-column reports. They look at the reconciliations and they basically say, yes, this lines up. And sometimes, and we all know this, there are human beings involved in every part of this. And sometimes you're going to be off by 1 or 2 inside a polling location. Usually it's provisional that wasn't taken account of properly. But you don't have the time, especially in our window. They have to, normally it would be November 11th for the certification under our law this year, but that's a federal and state holiday for Veterans Day. So it's going to be 5 p.m. on November 12th. And I know there's been a lot of discussion around the state election board rule saying they can look at all these things. They could already look at nearly everything they wanted to within a reasonable time period. And the good part is now is essentially nobody's arguing that it can't not be certified by November 12th. Even one of the state election board members who voted for the rule, she herself has said, yes, nobody's saying it's all going to be November 12th. And in Georgia, we're extremely lucky that we have relatively short time frames. We'll be done well before the date of attainment. So even if we have to go through the New Mexico, Otero County writ of mandamus, we should be in good shape. But one of the things I encourage every jurisdiction to do, don't think you're immune. Think through a plan for an individual who has standing inside that county to sue for writ of mandamus from bottom to the top, or you can do from the top to the bottom saying this county is interfering with our ability at a secretary level or a county level to execute our duties under the law. So you can go out from 2 different directions, which is kind of how we've been examining what we have to look at. And don't be coy. Basically say, if you try to do this, we're going to bring the powers of the courts against you. And in some states, I know this can be criminal. And there are real consequences to individuals on this. I'm not saying swing a club around, but say we will use everything within our power to make this happen. And there are those who think they can magically hold up everything by one county, but the law is not designed to have one county hold up a whole state and hold up the whole nation. That is not going to happen. And the courts won't allow for that. Even if you do venue shopping,
Right.
We feel like everything will move pretty quick. And with the systems we have in place, the lawyers we have in place, we have game planned a lot of this out. And I would hope that every jurisdiction, whether you're a deep red state or a deep blue state, because we don't know how some of these rules and some of these things are going to happen this time, has game planned this out. And I highly encourage everybody to do that. And 99% of the people we work with are men and women of good faith. And there's 1% who could potentially try to cause more problems. And in doing that, in and of itself, it can create more uncertainty, even if they're going to lose and trying to cause those problems.
Yeah, I mean, you raised so many really good points there. And one of the points I would like to highlight is especially election officials all around the country know how complex and how many moving pieces there are in a presidential election, how it's a lot of, I often say it's 10,000 little elections all over the country, not a single election run by, hundreds of thousands of election officials relying upon millions of volunteers with 160 million people doing something they're not used to doing very often, which is voting. And Gabe, to your point, there's always going to be some errors. There's never been a perfect election run. The question is, are those errors so profound that they could affect the outcome? And if that's the case, a Florida 2000 type of situation, there's an avenue for that. There's the courts and legal review and evidence that has to be brought to bear. Someone's going to be disappointed at the end of that process, but that's still a process that has to be undertaken. And to your point, the local certification, even with some of the people advocating for delay, saying they're not going to delay, they might nevertheless try to leverage some of these very minor normal human errors that have been seen in every election, including, if they happen to be Trump supporters. Those errors also happened in 2016 when Trump won legitimately, and trying to leverage those to create a lack of stability and perhaps incite anger, which gets me to, and Secretary Benson, I'll come to you first on this. Despite the fact that no evidence has been brought to bear about any problems in the 2022 elections, despite the fact that our systems are more secure and transparent and verifiable than they've ever been, we have still seen multiple efforts to deny certification on frivolous grounds over the course of the last several years. And I know all three of you and many election officials in other states are preparing for what might come in the future here in 2024. I'm going to go to each one of you, but I'll start with you, Secretary Benson. What specific, and by the way, this is because I know your rules are a little different in each state, so it's really relevant to hear from different election officials. What are you specifically doing in Michigan to prepare for what might happen in 2024, maybe spurred by the losing candidate?
Well, I think two things. One, our state constitution is clear. Canvassers are required to canvass and certify based on the unofficial returns and tabulator tapes. When canvassers step outside of their legal duty and responsibility and guardrails and try to use or abuse their position to block election results or entertain conspiracy theories, it damages the election process. And we will be there to ensure that the law is followed, myself and the Attorney General. So at the outset, and we've done this consistently and continuously since 2020, making it clear even in a northern county in Michigan earlier this year that tried to delay election results or not certify, that the law is clear and we will enforce it. And we will make sure if we have to go to court to compel certification, to compel this basic ministerial process to continue, we will. And to also make clear, again, there are opportunities for people to raise questions about the process. There is transparency going into the process. There are procedural audits and other reviews conducted after certification, but those can't begin until certification happens. And so we try to both educate and ensure those in these roles know their jobs, be prepared to go to court to compel certification if we have to do so and enforce the law, but then also let others know that this is not about shutting down questions of the process. We welcome those questions. We welcome and embrace transparency. It's our friend when the facts are on our side and the law is on our side. And so we don't want to get caught up and tangled up in accusations of trying to block questions. We welcome those questions, but we also want to protect the process, follow the law, and also ensure that, given the negative consequences for communities, if canvassers fail to fulfill their duties, that it's very clear to everyone the role of the canvassers, its ministerial limitations, and the other opportunities that people have if they want to examine, question, ask for recounts and the like, so that, again, people know that their questions can be raised, but the canvassing process is not the proper venue, or pressuring canvassers is not the proper way under our law to have those questions raised.
Yeah, there's a couple great points there. I just want to highlight one. First, if anyone's interested, look at Delta County, Michigan earlier this year. Secretary Benson and her staff acted very swiftly and decisively and really stabilized the situation, I think, in less than 24 hours. It was really remarkable. And that's the kind of stability I think all election officials should be prepared for. I think another key point here, and it's really important, there is a legal path to challenge elections in every state. There is a method for doing that. But in many states, the certification or canvassing process is a precondition for doing that. And so what you might find is that someone who's denying or delaying certification is actually preventing the candidate they support from filing a legal challenge and shortening that candidate's opportunity to bring evidence to a court indicating there was a problem. So in some ways, it's self-defeating. It's why these efforts, although there's something serious that you all might have to deal with, are actually rather desperate and not designed for success. And Secretary Oliver, if I can go to you and ask you similarly in New Mexico, kind of to talk about how you're preparing.
I just want to echo literally everything my colleague from Michigan said. We're doing all of those same things. And I'll just add, the additional thing that I think we've been trying to do, especially since we saw what happened in 2022, is help educate. In my state, elections are certified at the county level by the Board of County Commissioners in that county. So it is, one of their, again, ministerial duties, not something they do very often. And in my experience in the past, it was, frankly, a rubber stamp, right? Because really at the end of the day, it's this accountability mechanism to say the folks responsible for reconciling and making sure everything adds up did that job. Right? That's what the canvas is. The canvas is making sure that everything adds up at the end of the day. And if something doesn't add up, explaining why, being able to articulate that in a meaningful way. And the board is supposed to come together, review all of that and say, hey, this was done. This was done the way it's supposed to be. State law was followed. Checkbox. So my, thinking this cycle is, in addition to all of the things that have already been discussed, that I really want, if you're a county commissioner in New Mexico, or frankly, and if you are responsible for certifying an election anywhere in this country, and you are able to be present during the canvass process and watch what happens with your own two eyes, ask questions during that process as you are able, that is so much a better use of time than, ignoring the process, having the hard work of the county folks doing the work of the canvass, bring all of this information to you, and then starting to pop off with questions that are not based on the process or where we're at in terms of challenging an election, et cetera, et cetera. So I really want to encourage folks to try to bring their canvass officials into the canvass process. I know that sounds totally obvious. It isn't in my state. And that is something we're going to be encouraging folks to do so that they can get those questions answered during the course of the canvass itself, and not when it comes time to sign up and certify and take that, again, non-discretionary ministerial step to certify.
Yeah, I really good points. And I also want to stress, New Mexico isn't thought of as a swing state necessarily here in 2024, but New Mexico has had to deal with some incredibly close elections. 2000 was an incredibly close election in New Mexico. People often forget it because Florida was close and
We're
it was,
closer than Florida.
but it was, I mean, so Secretary Oliver, by the way, in her role as a county election official and as a secretary, has had to deal with really close elections. And this idea that it wasn't really an issue until recent losers of elections have brought this up, I think is a really important point. And Gabe, I want to go to you because I know you've been putting particular thought into this, given some of the rhetoric that's been going on in your state, including some from the state election board. But how are you preparing in Georgia?
Well, one of the main things we have to be ready for is there's going to be a cadre, depending on who wins or loses, on either side that are going to be hell-bent for leather to do whatever it takes to stop the evil side from taking over. We know that's going to happen. It's been really more on one side than the other, and it happens to be my team, and I get that. But we have to be ready for all that. But one of the big things is there's what I call it there, basically regular folks who may engage in the last week and a half in this and kind of hear all this stuff around these, certifications and not certifications. So one of the things we're doing, like we do every single election cycle, is we're bringing all the media in for a background briefing to kind of lay the foundation. This is how it's supposed to work. David, asked one thing. I said, don't show me that damn Pepsi can in the middle of this. Being from Georgia, that's not a fair thing to do. So I'm just gonna do this now just to make it even. I got one of these around, so I just to have around just in case. We have to be focused on of educating the press, because the press doesn't understand all this. They think these state election board rules are somehow going to overrule the law, and they want to make it into a bigger. They love the drama. We're trying to take the drama out of this process. And to Secretary Oliver's point, and what I was saying earlier, these board of election members, and in some cases that we still have a handful of probate judges, who have all acted responsibly in this case. So I feel pretty good where our probate judges are. Who should be part of the process, not the week after, not the day of, but for the months beforehand. I think all of us have UACAFA ballots going out this week. I mean, that's all happening now. These are the processes that we're already into. This is a live election, and those people who have responsibility to certify ought to be brought into the process. And I've talked to the press, have you talked to some of these counties to say, what are they doing to examine the process now, so they can have comfort when it does come to that point at the end. And we made it very clear to our counties, again, our professional elections officials, I have no worries about. Some of the appointed officials are the ones who are making some noise, but we are very lucky in our state, to Mr. Becker's point earlier, you can't do a candidate challenge until you certify, because the way our Constitution is written, or our state law is written, there is nothing to challenge until there's a certified election in the books. And that's kind of how I have to set it, because that is the level set baseline of I'm challenging these results in this thing with these specific sets of information. And especially now with the date of attainment, safe harbor was there, but it's kind of loosey-goosey. Date of attainment feels much more like a rock solid wall we'll run into. So we really need to get as much of the legal process out of the way well beforehand. So we're talking to the parties, we're talking to third-party organizations saying, we know it's going to be close. Have your ducks in a row. We know you're going to file quickly, but don't mess with certification, because that interferes with your own ability to make these challenges, and educating the press to then educate the public, because we don't have a big enough bullhorn to educate the public on the intricacies of certification, which is really not that intricate, but it can be made to look complex by somebody who wants to obfuscate the process.
I want to pick up on that last point, this idea that sort of certification can get caught up in the disinformation cycles that we are seeing kind of with every election. I think we've heard a lot already about the plans that different states have in place to make sure that the election actually gets certified. But one thing looking ahead to the fall that I'm curious how you all are thinking about is, even if the election results are ultimately certified, the threat to refuse certification can itself kind of breed distrust and contribute to disinformation cycles, maybe particularly when we've seen some local officials say, okay, I'm going to certify the election, but I'm going to do it under duress. So Mr. Sterling, maybe this for you first, how can state officials shore up voter confidence at the same time that they are sort of stopping these efforts to obstruct certification?
Well, I don't know. The main thing is, in this particular case, in our state, we've got a Republican state legislature that has spent the last really 4 years passing laws to make the elections run better. And listen, they worked with our office on 90% of these laws. If they're then going to come back and question the outcomes, even after they've done all this, is it their own efficacy? Are they ineffective? If we can find ways to make it be in their own self-interests to be supporting the outcomes of this. And again, in 2020, our team assumed that Trump was going to win, and we were wrong. We now assume Trump's going to win, and we had a meeting this morning, and we said, okay, what do we do if Harris wins by a little bit? What do we do if Trump wins by a little bit? What do we do if Trump wins by a lot? What do we do if Harris wins by a lot? We have to game plan all of it, and there's no really great, not landmine-laden path to set what's going to be there. Our main thing is same thing we said in 2020, the same thing that, I'm sure Secretary Benson said and Secretary Oliver said. The votes were legally counted. They were cast by legal voters. This is the outcome. You may like it, you may not like it. We are not there to arbitrate around these other things. This is just the process. And we have to get to a point, and we've said this over and over again, where people accept the outcomes. And again, I'm so terrified to say I know what's going to happen because we are so fundamentally wrong the last few times. In 2022, it was great. Everybody accepted it. There was no complaints. We had close elections. People said, oh, we lost. We'll come back and fight again in 2 years. Here's the elephant in the room. We can't make the nominee of my party accept the loss if he loses in my state or another state. We are not going to be able to change that. We have to be prepared for discussing it in Reelsville and looking at the reality and just kind of putting our heads down and following the law and reporting the results as they are. Like I said, I think you will probably win this state, but again, I was wrong last time. So we have to be prepared for that. There's no good way to lay the foundation of saying we are referees. We are not partisans in these roles. And I think everybody on this panel has done a very good job of that with their own constituencies. And there are some states that are deep blue and deep red, and they haven't done as good a job of that. And they seem like they want to put their thumb on the scale. And that's not good for democracy overall. But I think for the vast majority, we look at ourselves as professionals and we try to stick with the laws, stick with the rules, and with a lot of transparency, as much transparency as you can possibly do. We have a data hub that shows this is how many people have voted. This is how many people have requested ballots. And it's updated in real time once we open the doors of everything, of all the absentee ballot requests. Early voting starts October 19th, and every day, every hour, it'll uptick and showing you can see which county. You see the gender, you can see the race, you can see the age. So we will know everybody who voted early voting by the Friday before the election. We will know everybody who requested an absentee ballot by 11 days before the election. So we know what we call the denominator, other than election day. And by 10 p.m. on election day, we have to report how many people showed up. We will know there's no such thing as a ballot dumps in the middle of the night. We will know the denominator. And I think that kind of transparency can help lead to some level of acceptance, even from some of those who may have questions.
Yeah, I there's a really good point there, and it is, on the one hand, it's just providing as much transparency as you can, because so much of this is outcome derived, not about any actual problem with the process, but only looking for problems when you don't like the outcome you want. So, for instance, I can't imagine the cry that would have come from Trump supporters if the Democratic Secretary of State of Pennsylvania had declined to certify results in 2016 when Trump legitimately won by just over 40,000 votes. Now, Biden legitimately won Pennsylvania by about twice that much in 2020, but regardless, both were legitimate wins and both were properly certified by the appropriate election officials at the time in that ministerial act that we've talked about. And kind of an allegory to certification at the state level is the activity of the vice president in the joint session of Congress on January 6th, where the vice president serves this purely ministerial role. Gabe, you've referred to the Electoral Count Reform Act and the importance of ascertainment of electors by December 11th, which is very important. Those guardrails are going to be helpful, those firmer guardrails in 2024. But to hear, for instance, the Republican vice presidential candidate say that he doesn't know that if he had been in the place of Vice President Pence in 2021, he would have sent the electors back to the states is remarkable to me, to hear him suggest that Vice President Harris has the ability to do that on January 6, 2025, win or lose, but which of course she does not. I mean, Vice President Pence acted admirably and consistent with the Constitution, his duty under enormous pressure in 2021. And so I think that's really important. And so to the point of deterring some of this bad outcome derived behavior, we have seen over the course of the past couple of years efforts to hold those who have denied certification accountable. There have been prosecutions in Arizona, for instance. Secretary Benson, you and your staff had to, I guess, remind election officials in certain counties that of what the law was and what the consequences might be. And that was a very effective deterrent. Can you talk a little bit about what the effect of prosecutions and reminding people of their obligations on the law might have as we're looking forward?
Yeah, I think we, it's easy for folks to kind of get caught up in a lot of the pressure that they're receiving. In our state, in the past, it's even been from elected officials, state representatives, and certainly campaigns. We needed, and myself and the Attorney General need to make quite clear to government officials that they can face personal consequences if they fail to uphold their oath and do their jobs, whether that means, influencing the canvassing, whether it means not allowing or allowing perhaps unauthorized people to have access to equipment that then damages the security of that equipment. The consequences are clear. Sometimes people don't think those through when they're under pressure. I mean, in our case, we had the former president actually calling canvassers with, exerting that pressure. And that's quite extraordinary for a local official to feel. And I understand that. But it's also important for us to let them know that the pressure of and the legal consequences, frankly, of violating the law are much greater. And if they do ultimately fail to uphold their oath and do their jobs, it's also helpful that the law is quite clear in Michigan. Canvassers have a clear responsibility laid out in our state constitution, both to take their job of verifying the accuracy of election results seriously and to not abuse their position or that responsibility by trying to do things outside of their legal authority. And we've been consistent. Officials who fail to abide by that law, by that oath, will face personal financial liability or more serious legal consequences. And it's also not going to work. The law will ensure that our canvassing is succeeds, that our elections are certified. And so trying to communicate the lack of likelihood or zero likelihood of success and the very dire legal consequences is twofold our approach. What we've seen, if I could add though, is sort of as we play out the game, I guess you could say, that we're in, is that now people in response are saying, oh, they're threatening us for simply asking questions. They're threatening us with the law. They're threatening us with legal consequences. And so we have to be careful to be clear that we're not saying you can't ask questions. There was a time and a place for that. It's not this. What we are saying is that the law is clear about what certificators' role is in this moment. And that is something that we all should abide by, respect, and follow.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Again, we talked about this a lot. This apparent strategy, mainly coming from people who appear to support Trump right now, is desperate. It's a failed strategy, and it's self-defeating. I mean, it can't succeed except in destabilizing things and inciting supporters of the losing candidate. Which brings me to the last question I want to ask, which is to all three of you. Secretary Oliver and Secretary Benson, you're both Democrats. Gabe Sterling is a Republican. I'll start with you, Secretary Oliver. If Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, wins New Mexico, will you enforce certification and ensure that electors are certified and ascertained for him by the deadline?
100%. I mean, there's no question that at the end of the day, and I think all three of the individuals here and most of our colleagues, if not all, understand that, our first duty is to the voter, and to, being a guardian for the accuracy of the vote, and for making sure that the accurate winner is the one that is certified. So yes, absolutely.
Okay, thanks. And Gabe, next to you, if Kamala Harris wins Georgia, even by a very narrow margin, we think elections will be very narrow in a lot of these states, not just Georgia. But if Kamala Harris wins, will you and your office enforce certification, ensure electors are ascertained for Kamala Harris by December 11th?
I think we've kind of proven our mettle on that one already. So yeah,
That was a softball.
again,
It's a softball for all three of you, but I agree with you 100%. Did you have anything else you wanted to add on that, Gabe?
I was going to say for Maggie, I mean, it's not really, if aliens come down and offer you gold bars, will you give them evenly to everybody? I mean, it's not going to happen for her. Now, Secretary Benson and I, different story.
Yeah. And now, Secretary Benson, to you, if Donald Trump wins Michigan legitimately by whatever margin, will you do the same thing as you've done before and ensure that the electors are certified and ascertained for him by the deadline?
Yeah, quickly, efficiently, and according to the law. Proudly, frankly, because that is actually our job and our duty, to make sure the will of the people rules the day, not the will of any particular candidate or party. And so I think you'll find also, as you ask us these questions, we're actually proud to be able to do that duty. It doesn't matter if we agree with the will of the voters or not. We're far more proud, and we've got far more love and respect for the voters and their will than any particular political party allegiance or candidate preference. And again, I take great pride in that.
I mean, I think you should. I mean, I think there's something inherently beautiful about members of one party certifying or overseeing the election of the other party. I mean, we don't have to think far back, not just what Vice President Pence did under incredible pressure, but what Vice President Gore did in early 2001, and what Vice President Nixon did in early 1961, both members of opposite parties, both having lost their election and overseeing a process that confirmed the election of their opponent. It's one of the reasons that our country at its best is the envy of the world. And I think you all should feel appropriately proud of that. And I'm going to hand it over to Jess now to talk about some more details and get into some of the questions. But one thing for those who are watching, I mean, we focus a lot on swing states. There's obviously the pressures have been most in swing states, but I think there's a possibility that these kind of certification pressures could apply in any state where the winning candidate has won, regardless of where that is. It could be California to New York, it could be Texas, Florida, it could be a variety of different places. And it's just as important to be prepared and ready for those, even if your state is not going to be decided by a narrow margin, because it might be that the threats just are so desperate that it doesn't matter what the margin is. And so, Jess, I want to hand it over to you because I know you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. So it's been, I think, really informative to hear directly from our panelists about how they are sort of really prepared to meet the moment if we do see further certification refusals. But we wanted to use the last few minutes of the webinar to talk a little bit about how, if you're from a state that is kind of approaching this issue with a little bit less direct experience, what you should be thinking about and doing now to make sure you're ready in the event that we do see certification delays in the fall. So, at Protect Democracy, we have been doing sort of deep research into state laws on certification in a number of places, but you all are really the primary experts on your states, those of you who are election officials. And so here are some of the questions that we'd invite you to ask as you prepare for this potential challenge. So the first is, really make sure you are familiar with your state laws on the certification process, including deadlines for local and state results and the timelines for other aspects of the process, like recounts and election challenges, particularly in the presidential election context, where we have to take the thousands of county level elections and processes and results and kind of sum them up to get a national result by the middle of December, when the Electoral College meets in the middle of December. It's important to understand how a recount appeals process might, for example, delay certification past the original deadline, so that you can think about how to plan to make sure your state is ready to meet the federal ascertainment deadline of December 11th. And then with that understanding of the timeline process and potential vulnerabilities, understand who has the authority to enforce certification through a legal action like a mandamus claim that we heard about earlier, where that legal claim could be brought, who would have standing, what the timeline would be. Your state may also have other avenues outside of court to enable certification to be completed through, for example, the state election board. And then finally, kind of with all of this information in your back pocket, think about plan ahead for how you would respond if there is a certification delay in your jurisdiction, so that the wheels can be quickly set in motion to ensure that results are certified on time. This plan could include other types of sort of prevention work, like we heard about from some of the folks on this call today, reaching out in advance to the county officials who will be responsible for certification, sort of bring them in and get them participating in the process kind of between now and November, so that they are not sort of engaging with their certification responsibility for the first time in the fall. Additional issues we encourage folks to be thinking about include the safety and security of elections and counting facilities, particularly in smaller communities that may not be prepared to be at the focal point of an election dispute of the kind that we've heard about today. We know that threats to election workers have increased in number in recent years, and being prepared to meet those threats with logistical and funding support is important. One resource we might point you to on this is the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, which has been helping to support local election officials working with their law enforcement counterparts to be ready for security challenges. And we have some resources that I think are going to get dropped into the chat for you. And we're also available if anyone has follow-up questions, but I will hand it over to Walker to take us into the Q&A.
And actually, if it's okay, I'm just going to say one more thing before we go into Q&A. What you just heard from Jessica is really, really important. And I hope you look at the guidance document. I usually boil it down just into some very simple, think in advance. Who has the authority to bring who has the responsibility to certify, and who has the authority to bring a legal action? Make sure they know what that authority is. What does the action look like? We've been talking about mandamus quite a bit. For those of you that aren't lawyers, that is a fancy Latin term that means we're going to make you do something that you don't want to do, but you are legally required to do. Then when, know your deadlines. Some states have really early deadlines for certification at the county and state level. They're going to have an advantage. You're going to know if there's any shenanigans, but well earlier. There are some states, California, Wisconsin, others that have state certification dates that are in December. Again, that's going to be really pressing you up against that December 11th timeline. You want your electors ascertained clearly by December 11th so that we can't engage in any more election denial that might destabilize things on January 6th. And also, what court do you file in? I mean, this is going to be a really important issue. I know we've got a question about that in a second, because that's going to be very relevant. But think about those things. Talk to your county and state attorneys in advance. Get them ready, and even where appropriate. I think about Maggie. You really dealt with this first, and how swiftly your staff, the Attorney General's office, the Supreme Court, the Governor's office, all dealt with this was remarkable, given that we had not really faced this before. That's a lesson, I think, to everybody, to be prepared, because the timeline in a presidential election is compressed. You don't want to go past that December 11th date. So with that, I'll hand it over to Walker to lead us through some of the questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so our first question, Gabe actually touched on this a little bit, but Secretary Oliver and Secretary Benson, if you all would like to answer this one. What is being done to help average people understand what to expect on and after Election Day? and educating local media so they can assist with this at the local level. Managing expectations seems to be important.
Well, I think we're all doing some form of direct workshop with the media in terms of, a briefing as we go into the election. All of our reporters, especially the ones at the local level, but, they have been really educating themselves over the last several years and really coming to understand a lot more deeply, how this election process works. I mean, Christina Cassidy, who asked the next Q&A question, probably knows more about how elections run than a lot of election officials at this point. So, I think, making sure that we're all, being transparent, having those conversations. It's nice, I guess, in a sense. And I know this is like a weird thing to say, but it's nice that the inner workings of the operations of elections are actually something that the news media does talk about now. And we saw a really great effort at that leading up to the 2020 election. And it's really just continued from there. And so we're just laying those seeds, doing that work. And since every election has its own flavor and its own issues that pop up, we are definitely going to work, and I'm sure my other colleagues are too, to address those specific questions and issues. And then, of course, there's the ones we always get, why does it take so long after the election? This state does it this way, that state does it that way. So just really that deep work, working with our local and national media friends.
So I'll just add, we've done a number of things because I agree, really preparing the public to understand every part of the process is our strongest play at demystifying and also debunking or pre-bunking misinformation. And so over the last year, we have set up a voter confidence council as well as local voter confidence councils where we have equipped faith leaders, business leaders, community leaders, educational leaders proactively with information or where to go for information so that they can be voices to people in their influential circles about our elections and instead of election administration. We're also partnering with Keep Our Republic and doing a day-long event on the 19th. I think, Gabe, you're going to be there as well as Brad and a number of others where there will be media and we will be going in granular detail every aspect of our elections process, as sort of doing a national briefing. And then we've also got a statewide briefing that David's going to be a part of in October for our media to, again, just give them all the tools they need to be experts in the process and help citizens as well. And the last thing I'll add is we've set up a democracy ambassador program where every week people who sign up to be an ambassador for democracy with a responsibility to share that truth will get a newsletter or is already getting a newsletter from our office that details what certification is, what we do to ensure we're removing ineligible citizens from or people from our voter registration database. Just all the facts that we've got at our disposal, trying to get that out to as many touch points as possible, and then really empowering not just the media or influencers, but all individuals with spheres of influence and even just kind of average citizens to be those ambassadors for truth and for democracy in this moment so that we can manage expectations as much as possible and create as many experts as possible. What we saw in 2020 was the same thing we saw in Florida in 2000. When there was a blank canvas of election information, misinformation and confusion can fill it. And so we're trying to fill up that canvas as much as possible going into this election with data and evidence and laws and facts and information so that it's much more difficult for the misinformation to take hold.
Gabe, did you have any other thoughts on that?
Just to Secretary Benson's point, misinformation and disinformation will be out there in an active kind of way. And for the people on the ends of the spectrum, they're not going to be saved, no matter how much facts and data you give them. But there's a vast majority, the 90% in the middle, Republican, Democrat, Independent, who at least want to have some basis of understanding about how the systems work. And are they ever perfect? No, they can't be perfect because there's way too many people involved. But all these processes and all the transparency we have, and essentially after 2020, there was a lot of laws passed around the country that really enhanced transparency. In some cases, I know some people thought it might have gone too far, but I think a lot of transparency with good rules around it is a great thing to give people that confidence in the outcome of the election. But we also need to level set and make people understand there are going to be errors. Errors do not equal fraud. Errors are normal. When Trump won in 16, there were a gajillion errors that nobody looked into because it's just what happens. Everything we saw in the 2020 election, we got accused of saying the perfect election. We never said that. Everybody who said we said that is a liar. What we basically said is what we saw is the same kind of issues we see in every single election, every single year. And 2020 in Georgia especially was very different because it was the very first year in 2 decades we had paper ballots. And now, one thing I think we can tell people nationwide, I think you told me this, we are now at 98% of ballots cast are on paper in this country. And having that ability to do reconciliation, having the transparency in the front to see how many people have requested ballots or voted early or voted in person, having all that available on the front end really can help to defray a lot of the kind of misinformation, disinformation we're going to see. Another level setting thing we have to be able to do, and unfortunately all of us in all of our states are going to have to talk about Pennsylvania and the ridiculous dumbassery of not having pre-processing of their absentee ballots. We're not going to know who wins Pennsylvania for 2 weeks. That is just a set, baked in the cake. It is done. I mean, so we just have to know that and be willing to and prepared to talk about that in all of our states.
So first of all, everyone, you got your quote for today. Pennsylvania's ridiculous dumbassery. Jocelyn, I saw you trying to go ahead, chime in, because then
we got Pennsylvania in February. I'm sorry, February on Friday of election week, in 2020. That's when Pennsylvania came in. So, but I'll just add, like, setting that expectations are key. What we ultimately did in Michigan actually is set expectations beyond, meaning we told everyone that, and there was like math and data behind this, that our results wouldn't be, this was in 2020, available until Friday, to not expect unofficial results until Friday. But we had a plan actually to have those results done within 24 hours of the polls closing, which was Wednesday. Ultimately was Wednesday at 4 o'clock that they were done. And so we were able to sort of manage expectations, but also set the view that things would take longer, so that when they didn't take as long, the idea was we would be able to show that, in fact, the process was much more efficient. It was sort of a different way of managing expectations. What, of course, we didn't anticipate was that other states weren't going to be done. And so no one really cared that we were done. And they just shifted the focus to Nevada and Arizona and Pennsylvania. And so I do think we also need to figure out how to be lockstep in how we're managing those expectations for all of us.
Go ahead, Gabe.
We, all of us, and frankly, David, you helped us see this, to tell people it's going to be a longer time than normal. It's a close election, and we have all these absentee ballots in states that normally don't do this many absentee ballots. It's going to take a while. And for Georgia, you know, we had 3 days to cure. We had UACAVA ballots coming in that Friday, and it was just going to be that way. But there were states that were done well before other states with wider margins. And one thing I didn't get to, I want to talk about, when it comes to certification, we all have our unofficial results that go up on the election night reporting, the ENR. I have grave concerns about stuff that gets reported on ENR or spoofed ENR, or ways that can start the disinformation early on election night, where somebody makes a mistake or somebody does an intentional spoofing of a site and gets onto Twitter. And then we're trying to explain to people we're certifying the actual official results versus what you saw that night, because that wasn't real, because A, there was a mistake, or B, somebody's intentionally messing with it. We have to be prepared for that to happen this time.
There's so much good in there. I hope everyone got all of that. There is, in every state, what you're seeing for the first several days, at least in some cases several weeks, are the intentional unofficial results that election officials have prioritized getting to you fast, with the understanding, and you've all heard about level setting and setting expectations, which these three are so good at, so many other election officials are good at, saying these are unofficial. We're getting you these because you want to know them, and that's good. But there might be some mistakes. That's what certification is actually for. We are trying to make sure that everything has been reconciled, that everything matches up, that the math all adds up. There is essentially a very obvious math error in Secretary Benson's state on election night in 2020. It was caught very quickly, but it fueled so much disinformation. And these are the kinds of things that we need to set expectations about in advance, because it's very likely that a losing candidate may attempt to fill that vacuum or any unofficial results and mischaracterize it as something, as a reason to to disregard the actual election outcomes. And I'll also say, in terms of setting expectations, there's a key factor that no matter how good your rules are, no matter how good your laws are, no matter how good your election officials are, no matter how hard they're working after a 16-hour day and how many cans of Red Bull they've drunk, they cannot do anything about the margin of victory. And the margin of victory is going to drive how media can set expectations, and when they can call races, which a lot of people think is when it's official, it's not. A media call is just a call. And I'm glad Secretary Benson raised that point about Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's shooting for Thursday and Friday. They don't have good laws. They begged, the election officials begged their legislature to do what Secretary Benson and her team and the legislature in Michigan did, which was to allow for the pre-processing of mail ballots so that they could get those results out to you earlier, along with a lot of other reforms. I don't mean to imply that was all you did, Secretary Benson, but those are very good. But look, those laws are going to be, we all know the laws are locked in now, right? The procedures are locked in. They should be locked in. Election officials are doing a lot. There's not a lot of room for change right now. So just setting those expectations, if for media on the call, being ready and listening to your election officials about that. If it's really, really narrow, send them gifts, give them hugs, because there's nothing they can do about that, but they will still meet their certification deadlines. Of that, I have absolute confidence.
Okay, our next question is, have you considered whether there may be an attempt to get the certification issue into federal court, given that state courts have so far upheld the process and compelled officials to certify? What would such a claim look like? The arguments that might be made, in your assessment of the likelihood of success on those claims?
I'll just say quickly and then hand it off to them, because I'll just say, I think if a losing candidate is ready to delay or stop certification and there's likely to be, they're going to throw everything at the wall, and it could include federal. Now, look, if there's a legitimate election challenge, Florida 2000, remember, there was both a state and federal court track there. And that's appropriate, by the way. I mean, it is appropriate for the courts to weigh in. It is appropriate for the parties to have to bring evidence. And that's okay. What's not appropriate, and we're seeing this to some degree, are frivolous cases being brought without evidentiary backup to muddy the waters and to fuel the disinformation that is ultimately going to be used to fuel the grift and potentially anger. And I'll now throw it open to anyone else that wants to chime in.
I just think it's important to remember that there are two tracks to the challenges of certification. One is actually to try to block certification. Two is to create a narrative of chaos and confusion and illegitimacy that can have multiple different advantages for those trying to create it. And so if you look at it, and that second track is actually far more dangerous and far more, like, there's a far higher likelihood of success than the actual blocking going through the courts. So when you look at it through that framework and that decision making, that, yeah, of course we should assume federal court, as David said, throw everything against the wall, because it's not necessarily, you don't file 60 court cases and lose all 60 court cases because you believe you have legitimate legal claims. You do so because it's a PR strategy. And so, if that's par for the course, then yes, a federal case could be a PR strategy. And we're already seeing that in many fronts in Michigan and in other states. And so, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think if there are federal suits filed, let's assume they are, the message doesn't change. Like, none of the noise changes the facts, the data, the numbers, the will of the people, whatever that may be. And so I do think it's going to be important to see lawsuits, and I know many of you do, as not a legal strategy, but a PR strategy, and to respond in kind and help the citizens who are watching all this unfold still have confidence and clarity in our elections. Because if we allow a sense of illegitimacy to falsely take hold, then again, there are far more reaching consequences for our democracy than a few court cases may ultimately engender.
Okay, the next question is, are there any circumstances in which an election official may be justified in delaying certification for a few days beyond the deadline?
I would say, because let's play this out. I'm a former law professor, so let's play out the hypothetical. I think I mean, the job in Michigan is for the clerks to bring the numbers to the canvassing board for them to review. If something like if a clerk tripped and fell on the way and like didn't get the numbers there in time, or like if there was some problem with transmission, or just like then maybe, but it would be more of a procedural issue that would be causing it than a substantive one. And again, but I would say very, very rare, very sort of narrow to play out, but it would be something involved with, not presenting the data that is needed to allow certification, or some sort of something that would block that. And it's hard to, hypothetically think through all those ideas, but it would be much more procedural than it would be substantive.
Agreed.
Yeah. I can't think of a reality place where that's going to happen, where it's like there's something so dramatic. But like, as an example, in 2020, we saw Floyd County and told them, guys, you had 2,400 more check-ins than you have ballots cast. You should probably look around your office for a while. And they did, and they found them. So, I mean, we have all these procedures in place to kind of catch that big thing Secretary Benson was kind of laying out and Secretary Oliver's agreeing with. It's like, if there's something that rises to a level where it could be legitimately, we said, this is not anywhere near correct. If you're talking about there's 5 ballots in a polling location that you can't figure out what happened, or like you have more check-ins than you have votes, I mean, what we could possibly have is somebody who didn't read the signs, folded up their ballot and walked out with it. I mean, that's going to happen in some of these places. So you can't let those minor things get in the way. But if there's something major, we would then have to look at the courts. We'd have to look at ways to kind of get it done in time, or begin the certification process for the state while trying to get these final things put together. Again, it's not a straitjacket. These laws are designed to get vote counted, not to get votes not counted. So that's what we're trying to get to at the end of the day, and get all the legal votes cast by legal people counted properly. And there's some people who claim some of the chain of custody documents aren't signed. Well, that's just a training issue where you'll hit the county's hand next time. You don't disenfranchise the 2,400 people who had ballots in that Dropbox. That is not the remedy in these cases, even though some people believe it is.
That's such a good point. I mean, we're literally talking about what people are doing at 10 or 11 at night after being at work since 4 or 5 a.m. and they're volunteers and they're doing the best they can. And sometimes they make mistakes, and that's not a reason to disenfranchise entire precincts, which is a little bit ridiculous. I think this issue, certification is a thing that happens in a moment in time. It is by a deadline. I don't think anyone is saying that if, as Gabe indicated, there was some kind of, oh, this looks weird. Can you just take another look about this before you hit the deadline and certify? I don't think anyone's suggesting that's a problem at all. If you meet your deadlines and are trying to make sure that it's as buttoned up as you can, that's, I think, a worthy aspect of your role as a certifier or canvasser. But it's when you're looking for excuses to either delay or to spread disinformation because you think that might fuel claims later on, that's an illegitimate use of a canvasser's or certifier's role.
I want to add one more other possibility, and it's becoming more and more of an issue that our elections are being affected by catastrophic natural occurrences. A couple of years ago, I ran a statewide election in the middle of the biggest forest fires we'd ever seen in the state, and though that did not impact the post-election process and certification process, I do just want to put a pin in what if a Hurricane Sandy or something like that were to occur during a certification process, and really that work was heavily impacted, right? That I think, is a scenario I could envision. But again, I think, that's a severe hypothetical. And I really think that, my colleagues here have really made the point that, it would really take a lot. It would take literally like an act of God, for something like that to be legitimate.
Okay,
and just to jump in quickly on that, I think that's a situation where you might see officials going to court to get an extension, kind of blessing the extension of the deadline. Like, it is a legal deadline 100%. And there are tools that, you know, the courts and the whole system has some flexibility to make sure that votes get counted, as Gabe was saying. But I do think it's important to really underline the importance of meeting that deadline as a legal obligation in most of these states.
Yeah, and I also just want to point out how resilient election officials have been in the face of some of these unexpected occurrences, not like intentional attacks. I mean, 2012 Hurricane Sandy hit in the week before the election, and election officials up and down the Eastern Seaboard found new polling places, found power, found generators. Most election officials have generators ready. You know, there was a CrowdStrike problem in Arizona during early voting, which they navigated masterfully, and it didn't affect any voters. So for all of these legitimate concerns, and we hear them a lot, I am always just so impressed how election officials from the Secretary of State's level down to local county staff are just on top of these things. They're the ultimate, you know, get it done kind of people.
Okay, just one note we have here. Says not a question, but to Gabe's point, yes, as of today, we expect 98.6% of voters voting in jurisdictions that use paper ballots or machines that have paper audit trail. So just
Yeah, I'll just say, first of all, credit to Verified Voting, which compiles all this information. It's what my organization, the Center for Election Innovation and Research, relies upon, and it's absolutely true. Voter marked ballots, and well over 95% of the 95% of voters voting on voter marked ballots, including all 3 of your states. And as Gabe mentioned, 2020 was the first election in 2 decades where that was true in Georgia. That another 3% plus are voting on ballots with paper backups that can be recounted and audited. And the only places where they are voting without paper at all are the entire state of Louisiana and a few counties in Texas. In every single battleground state, every voter votes on paper, and every state has audits to confirm that machines work well. So when you inevitably hear that the voting machines didn't work right because some dictator came back from the dead and fixed it that way, remember, you know, in these 3 states, in all of the states, they have the paper they can go back to. And I'll give a shout out. I know Secretary Benson and Secretary Oliver did similar things, but Georgia was under such a microscope in 2020, first time with paper ballots in 2 decades. And they counted every presidential ballot 3 times, 3 different ways, once entirely by hand. I didn't think, Gabe, you could get it done. As you know, you got it done in 5 days. So when you hear the stuff about the machines, and if there are people who have certification responsibilities who are raising things about the machines, recognize there's a part of the process where there are recounts and audits available. And ultimately the paper is going to drive that.
okay. David, do you want to wrap up?
Sure. Just really briefly, I really want to thank the panelists. I want to this is a very busy time, as you all know, and the election officials, you're all dealing with a very busy time, and there are pressures on you that aren't what we hope we'll go back to as normal pressures in the election cycle. But this is going to be a very contentious election. There's going to be a ton of disinformation spread, and also I think it's going to be a very high turnout election. I don't know if we're going to meet levels of 2020, but I think it's possible. And there's going to be tremendous pressures on you. Hopefully this will serve as a resource for you. I know we at the Center for Election Innovation and Research, our research, Jessica, I know you at Protect Democracy have been as well. I think you should feel free to reach out to us if there's ever anything we can do to help. And I think we'll all be working together to, I think one of the key things is setting expectations, really making clear what the responsibilities are, what the role of certification is in the process, what they should expect in the aftermath of Election Day. And lastly, I'll just say to those of you that observe, tomorrow is National Voter Registration Day, and let's see how many we can get registered from all parties across the political spectrum.
Great, thanks. Jessica, do you want to make any closing remarks?
Just to build on David, I think thank you to everyone thank you to the panelists and to everyone who joined for their attention to this important issue as we head into the fall, and particularly when there's so much else going on on your plates.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this was recorded and we will share with everyone who registered. We'll share this recording. It will also be available publicly on CEIR's YouTube channel in the coming days. So we'll get that up as quickly as we can, but you can watch this recording. And yeah, thank you all for
Please.
joining us.
Yeah, I'll just say, Walker, really quickly, please share it with your colleagues in other states. We had really great representation from a lot of states on this, but we want to make sure all states, it doesn't matter whether those states vote for Trump or for Harris. We want all states to have these issues on their radar so they can be prepared in case anyone oversteps their legal duties with regard to certification.
Yep. Yeah, we'll send it around so everyone will have the link to that recording. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.